things that we'll just whiz through Matt's user group on the 12th of May. I know I'm speaking at it. I think, Laura, are you speaking at it as well?
Yeah.
Cool. That's two of us speaking about it.
I'm doing adaptive cards.
Awesome. Love adaptive cards. And I'm doing a new session on model-driven apps for dummies, or non-dynamics, folks.
God, that's going to be good.
Oh, yeah.
It's
going to be challenging.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, so I was going to explain exactly, why you would use model-driven apps over just the Canvas apps. Chris has organised Hack for Good for MBAS 2nd, 3rd of May, so that should be cracking. And then obviously we've got the MBAS, the full thing, which is now an online event on the 6th of May. So Microsoft Business Application Summit. So hopefully some really interesting stuff coming out of that. And the Power Platform Virtual Happy Hour is back again on the 20th of May. So I know they did one last night, which I think went down pretty well. I think they did get Zoom bombed, so that sounded like it was fun. So we've got some happenings going on. CPS are doing some virtual app in a days, and we're also starting to do a new one, a project app in a day. So if you're interested in project online or project management, project app is the new project for the web, and it is CDS based. So that'll be quite an interesting one if you're interested in how to manage projects using Common Data Service. So and
we've got a virtual app in a day. I've got my second virtual app in a day that I'm running on the 26th of May. I think
there you go. Awesome.
I'm earlier that week, you're later that week.
Yeah, and they've been going pretty well. We did one last week. I think you did one a couple of weeks ago as well, didn't you? So
yep.
Yeah.
Biggest blocker is chatting teams.
I'm looking at doing some dashboard in a days.
Of course, dashboard in a day goes well with app in a day.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of in a days coming up then.
And so also, can I point out? I maybe Chris can tell us the proper URL for it. The site that's got lots of these things on, like it had tonight's on. It had.
Oh, the virtual web.
Oh yeah.
What's the site, Chris?
So it's there's a reason we've done this, and I'll tell you why. But it's virtual events. That's plural. virtualeneventshub.com. And part of the reason that I stuck it up is because the Zoom bombers are looking for Zoom tags on Twitter. But if you've got a website in the way of it, then it stops that. So yeah. But feel free to log on. You don't have to create an account. It's just like a free site that you guys can log on to and check out what's going on.
So yeah, tons of stuff in there, everything from virtual lunches to Dynamics user groups, Power Platform Virtual Happy Hour, loads of stuff on that. Costume Party Happy Hour. Oh.
That was a John Levesque event, dude. We don't want to talk about that.
So yeah, lots of stuff. So yeah, virtual events. We'll post that out on Twitter as well. virtualeventshub.com. Cool. Right, I will crack on. So that's me. Let's swap over to something a little more interesting than my face. Something a lot more interesting than my face, hopefully. Right, so I'm going to talk about how to feed students, which is a bit of a weird one, but this is a real life scenario that we started doing with a university, and basically they had students who pay for catered halls, so they pay up front for food. And part of the challenge that the university had was that they were issuing paper vouchers. Students know how to use photocopiers, and so it wasn't exactly the most reliable solution. What the students would do, they would take the paper vouchers, they would hand them to one of 6 different locations across the university, and they would then claim their free food. So the university didn't actually know how many of these were being claimed, so it couldn't say that they were making money from it or how much. They didn't know where they were being used in terms of the different locations, and they also didn't know how they were being used in terms of were lots of people all going to one location at a specific time for breakfast or lunch, dinner, etc. So the solution that we came up with for them was a mix of various different components in the Power Platform. So they already had a lot of data around this system because they were already taking payments. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel in terms of creating new data for them that recorded who had paid. What we wanted to do was to take that data and actually use that data as the basis of the system. So we wanted to get that data from the on-prem SQL database they had. So using data flow to pull that through into the common data service, where we could do two things. We could have a model-driven app for the administration of the process, and then we could also have a Canvas app that we issued to the different retail outlets. Now, the benefit here for the Canvas app was that it could go on a mobile device, and one of the things that we needed to do was to make sure that we could easily identify the students. And so luckily, the student ID cards had a barcode on them. So we wanted to use the barcode reader that was basically built into the devices and embed that in the Canvas app, so that the Canvas app would be really simple for the retail outlets to use, and then the information to go back into the common data service, and then their own BI team could just access that information and build their own Power BI. But this meant that everything was secure. We could secure it so that only a few people had access to it who needed to have access to it. And it was very easy for the retail outlets to actually use it without interrupting the processes that they were already doing. So it was built on existing functionality that they already had based on the data. And so that was what we wanted to do. We were asked to do this about 10 days before it went live, before the students were coming back. So it was quite tight in terms of the amount of time that it took to do this. So that's about all the slides I wanted to go through. So let's show you what this actually looks like. Let's find the right thing. Right. So what we did was, this is a demonstration environment. So in here, we've got some source data. And this is to simulate what the data was doing in terms of coming from other systems. So in here, we've got some, if it loads, we've got some Excel files. So we put these in here just to be able to demonstrate how the data flows would actually work. So when we come into Power Apps, we've got our data flows here. Now, if you're not familiar with the data flows, this was one of the key things that made it really easy because we were using the CDS. When you create a new data flow, you get a lot of different options in terms of where you can pull the data from. And because we really didn't want to reinvent the wheel in terms of the data that they already had, we wanted to utilize what they already had. So once we'd set up a data gateway, there's lots of data that we can pull through here. And when you pull this through, you basically, we can wire it up to a database. For this demonstration, we just wired it up to an Excel file.
Sorry to interrupt, guys. I can only see the slide still. Is that just me, or is that? Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot.
Oh, I don't know whether I did anything there. That was just like magic. Yeah, I mean, just shout if you've got any questions as well. So the data flow, to reuse the existing data, this is a really powerful tool. It's a massive benefit of CDS just to be able to bring in existing data and then to build on it. So we were bringing the data in. We schedule these to run every day. It just synchronized all the data. And then once that data came in, our model-driven app, we had, so we've got students in here. So, as I say, development environments. So we've got one student, and we didn't really need much information for this. This was a really light touch in terms of we would bring through the students that were entitled based on the database that we were pulling data from. And then all we needed for each student was essentially this barcode. And that matches their student ID, the barcode on their student ID card. And then we had a process that would go through and create new vouchers every night. The reason for creating them every night was that we didn't want to load them all up to start with. We wanted it just to be every day they create them so that if they drop out of the program, then no more are created. And so we just got a scheduled flow that goes through and just creates these each night. Now, all this does is it creates them and it says the voucher type. So the idea here is we've got 3 different vouchers. and then the student goes in, and then what they want to do, and now this is where we check and see whether the power of Wi-Fi actually works, and magic stuff. So when we have the actual retailers, so the retailers basically just have this simple little app, and this simple little app, it's got a couple of things in it. So it can say where they are. So we defined different locations for them. So when we do that, it sets up the different opening hours. Once you've got that in there, what we can do is we can then click on the student barcode. So if I come to scan a barcode, and I have some books, which are great for testing barcodes. So that's come up and said it's not valid. So it's basically done a lookup to the CDS, and it said, actually, this barcode doesn't exist, so therefore this student isn't entitled to any free food. Now, if I try a different barcode, and again, this is just using the out-of-the-box barcode scanner on the device. So it comes up, yes, I want to redeem it, and so that's done. Now, that little issue that we talked about in terms of the being able to photocopy the codes, if I do that again for exactly the same barcode, it'll say it's already redeemed. And that is the sum total of what the app does. It doesn't do anything other than just scan the barcode and check and see, is the student entitled? If so, have they already redeemed the voucher or not? And that was all they needed to do. But it was a revolution for their retail staff to be able to do that. And also the data that they captured over the year, they worked out that they were approximately using about 50% of the vouchers that were being sold. So therefore, it was actually really quite a profitable little business that they had going on. So some of the interesting things that we learned doing that, the benefit of bringing the existing data was a real eye-opener for them. We're now doing several other projects with the same institution based on existing data and being able to augment that data in various ways. Rather than changing everything that they've got, we can start to build out new capabilities on top of that existing data. The use of the model-driven Power Apps for administration, they absolutely loved that. And the thought of using a Canvas app for day in, day out line of business applications really wasn't very appealing to them. So being able to know that the Canvas apps can be there for mobile usage for end users is great. That you can use GPS, you can use photos, you can use the barcode scanner. That's a really powerful tool. But knowing that you can use a line of business application built on model-driven apps, and a user isn't going to be, they're going to just feel like it's a normal application that's been built for them, massively powerful. Use of capabilities on the device. It was a little bit of a mixed blessing there. We did this really quickly, and some of the things that we identified were the barcode scanner. It got upgraded just before we did this, so that was good. But what we did identify was that the definition of the minimum device that is needed for using a Canvas app doesn't necessarily work particularly well when you're going to be using things like a camera on the device. So they bought some devices that were as cheap as they could get, but the cameras were shocking. And so actually scanning the barcodes was really quite a challenge for them. And also the light conditions were quite poor. So there were a few things that they identified that maybe they would have wanted to have changed. They did end up changing all the devices. But fundamentally, what they got out of the end of the process was an understanding of how powerful the Canvas apps can be for using them on mobile devices and, you know, wandering around a university campus, how powerful the model-driven apps can be, and how they can use existing data so they don't have to build big integration pieces to move data from system to system. So for a relatively quick and easy project, it was quite a good example of the power of Canvas apps and power of the Power Platform as a whole. So that's a really quick whistle-stop tour of a very simple application that really demonstrated to an institution how powerful the Power Platform actually is. Any questions?
This is awesome.
I take it if they haven't got their voucher, they've got to pay money then.
Yeah, they do, unfortunately. Yeah. But it was quite interesting because they had barcodes. One of the things that we wanted to use was RFID, but that isn't quite there yet. But having one of the things, the barcodes, was quite interesting because we did this. We got some sample student ID cards. We tested it. We scanned the barcodes. All great. Unbeknownst to us, when they had their new intake of students September last year, they changed the format of the card slightly, and they squished the barcode just a little bit, which made it unreadable. So they had to reprint quite a few cards to back with the proper format of barcode that was actually readable by the barcode readers on the phones. It wasn't a situation that we were anticipating we would have to deal with in terms of the physical printing of those barcodes. Excellent. Well, that's kind of it from me on that. So unless there are any other questions, I guess we can move on.
Dude, this is. I just want to talk something. This is an interesting problem because it's not. You solved a very interesting problem here, and it's not something that is normal within like the HE sector. But actually, like I've seen this a lot of times in retail.
Yes.
Loads, and like the concept of the barcode renewals and all this type of stuff. It's never been an easy thing to solve. I mean, Sancho will know this, but there's a company in South Africa called Edcon, and about 8 years ago, I tried to do something very similar to this 9 years ago in version 2011, and I struggled. There was a lot of code involved. So what you've done is actually solve a much bigger problem than I think you know of.
Yeah, this is such a great use of the barcode reader.
Yeah, I think that anywhere that you have barcode readers, the other one in education that's quite big is the QR codes. Anything where you've got facilities where you need to identify a room or a door or anything, and if you can just take a picture of a QR code and know exactly where something is, you don't need to worry about it's corridor 7, building 6, 7th floor.
And I think the beauty about the QR code is it handles scaling changes, whereas a normal barcode doesn't. Those barcode gaps have to be quite precise. But a QR code, as long as you've got those positioning squares, it doesn't matter whether it's a 20-foot barcode or a 2-centimeter one.
Yeah, I think that, but you do. The interesting thing about all of this is you still need that mobile device with the camera on it to take the picture, and it has to have that barcode reader capability. I can't do this on my laptop with a camera. I need that barcode reader or QR code reader built in, which is where the Canvas Power apps really have the power.
The old Canvas app web scanner, the web-based barcode scanner was it did work, but you had to tell it exactly what barcode you were looking at, and it didn't touch QR codes. Now, one of the things that we found recently, building a close contact app in my spare time, is there's a bunch of APIs that return a QR code, and you can cache that as an image, so you can capture that on a collection. And then you can lob that QR code into your data source, whatever your poison might be, and then use Flow to print that out on a PDF and stick it on a wall. So you can do that kind of end-to-end bit where you want to have that QR code on the door or the whatever it was, that enables you to kind of square the circle. Because when we first started doing all the QR code stuff and the barcode stuff, like way back when with the barcodes, the biggest problem wasn't scanning them. That was the easy bit. The problem was generating them.
Yeah.
Like for CDS, it's easy because you just embed that. You embed the GUID. Like there's no better thing to embed than a GUID in a QR code because you're laughing. But then, like whatever your poison is, whatever your data source is, you've got to. And it's not, SharePoint can have GUIDs in it as well. So like, just go for that.
SharePoint's got plenty of GUIDs, more than enough
exactly.
to go around.
So embed that GUID, and it's like you could put that QR code anywhere, and anyone who comes to scan it, it's going to mean nothing.
Yeah.
You know, it requires the context.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is you always need the context with these. But it's so much easier to use those codes, use the QR codes and the barcodes. And if you've already got an existing estate with all of those there, you can set it up to use those so long as the devices will scan them.
Awesome. Cool.
So I will stop sharing now and hand over to who's next. I think it's Mr. Hunt, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Mr. Hunt.
Cool.
Are we going to? Are we pausing to clap in a minute? Oh, no, it's later on, isn't it? That's 8 o'clock.
That's at 5 to 8. Yeah, so I'm going to stop about 5 to 8. Hopefully, I can get through the demo. And let's share. So you guys should be seeing my slides. Hopefully,
we are.
Brilliant. Cool. So this is my first session at the Power Platform User Group. So a lot of people probably don't know me. I'm a wood turner as well as playing with SharePoint and Power Platform and various things. So if people are wondering why I had a background of a shed, that picture is actually me in my shed, and that's a few things that I do when I'm not doing computer stuff. So this session really came about from a conversation with a client, and we were looking at how to deploy teams for them. And as part of the teams, we were looking at how do we configure the SharePoint sites, how do we deploy some of the governance around those sites. I had a sleepless night, and it's one of these things that, and really why I kind of took on the idea of inception, was I find that if I go to sleep on a problem, I sometimes wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning with the idea in my head, and if I don't write it down, I lose it. So sometimes sleep with a notepad next to your bed, because I guarantee you'll solve a lot of problems that way. So the idea really was how do we deploy these flows? The deployment story of flow isn't brilliant by a long shot at the moment, and we had this wonderful way of deploying SharePoint site scripts, and what we really wanted to do was, as we deployed a site to sit under this team, was to also deploy a particular flow for the client, so that when things happened, flows happened, and it was all automated. The problem was, how do we get there? So hopefully this session will take you through the story of that. So I've got a couple of takeaways from this. There's obviously the technique for deploying a flow from a flow, but also I wanted to show just how I've found the ability to kind of reverse engineering some of the results you get using the Microsoft connectors. Have a look at how you can do that isn't necessarily in that rather wonderful expression editor, which is a bit on the small side. So really that's what I want you to take away. I've got a couple of community shout outs. I got this working thanks to these two. So Serge Luco is a good friend of mine. I was umming and ahhing about how can we do this, and he said, hey, have you actually looked at the Power Automate management connector, because you can create flows of that? And I was like, wow, I didn't consider Automate. I was actually asking him, can we do this through PowerShell or other ways? So I got so far, and then I got really stuck, and John Liu had a brilliant solution which really gave me the way forward. So our scenario basically is, we wanted to deploy new sites with a particular template, and have a flow connected to the document library in each of those sites. So it's a bit of a small screenshot there, but we were using site scripts to deploy SharePoint. And this works really well. You can predefine, creates a SharePoint site. It runs a bunch of stuff afterwards. And the cool thing is we can trigger a flow off the back of that site script. So the concept here was that we could trigger a flow to create a flow. So as I said, we looked at using the Power Automate management actions, and the key one here is the create flow action. So you select your environment, you basically give it a display name, you pump in a definition, you give it a flow state, and you give it your connection references. Looks really, really simple. And the key thing is this flow definition. So when you break it down, it's quite simple. We've got the inputs to the flow, the schema, the version, and then this is the 4 things we need: parameters, triggers, actions, and a little description. Looks nice and simple. So I played with it, and if you recognize this scene, it's where it all goes a bit wrong. So let's jump into the first demo, and we're going to use our very basic flow here. So I take it you guys can see the flow screen quite happily. I'm not still on the slides.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yep, excellent. So because I'm going to be calling this from HTTP, just to test this and sample it, I'm just using a manually triggered flow. In the production sample that we actually created for the client, that was obviously replaced with an HTTP trigger. All we're doing is we're getting a flow from my environment. I've got a flow set up already on a library, and then I'm literally recreating the flow. So we're taking the flow definition that comes out of the get flow, and we're taking the connection references that comes out of that. Now, I will say when you first drop create flow on the screen, it won't be in this format. In fact, let me just add a new step so you can see what it looks like. So create flow. So you'll get the connection references in this built up. And if you want to pull in connection references from another flow, you just need to push this button here and switch it to an input array. And that solves that problem. So we let that one run. I'm not going to run it now. We'll just go back to the previous one that I did when I was testing. If we look at our get flow, we've got this wonderful flow definition. I'd love to be able to resize this to actually read the whole definition, but I can't. But Control A, Control C, and Visual Studio Code is your friend here. So this is that definition dropped into a JSON format file in Visual Studio Code. And what's nice is we can actually look at this quite easy. So I can shrink down my parameters, triggers, actions, and descriptions. So we can see now our flow definition. So we look at our parameters. I've got nothing here that I need to change. We look at our triggers. I'm using a file is created trigger on this flow that we've copied. We're triggering on new file items. We've got an API connection. And here's when we first have something we need to change. So the site that this is coming from is from one of my test sites. And it's in the shared documents folder path. So these are the two things that we're likely to want to change. We then look in the actions. We can see this is the actions that are used. There's nothing in here that I need to change. So actions is okay. So of everything that we want to copy, shrink parameters, triggers, actions, we just want to change the triggers. So nice and simple. So I've gone into my JSON here and I've come down and I've changed the URL that we're going to. And there's actually also when I can scroll right, there's also the GUID because SharePoint lives on GUIDs. In fact, I think GUIDs were invented for SharePoint. I'm pretty certain. They seem to live everywhere in it. So this is the list ID that we're attaching to. So I thought, great, let's paste that straight back into our flow. So if I go back to the edit now, and in our create flow, we'll get rid of that flow definition, and we're just going to paste that in. And straight away, I'm getting some errors in the flow checker. And I've got to correct to include a valid reference to get my profile. But this flow isn't using get my profile. We're just using manually trigger, get flow, create flow. If we look at the flow definition, we can see what's starting to happen here is that the flow definition is starting to actually correct our JSON. So there's the send email is now being given parameters from this flow. So these connections are basically all getting a bit screwed up. So this is where I got a little bit confused, and I reached out to the community. And that's where John helped me with Pokemon Flow. And I don't know if anyone's seen John's Pokemon Flow. It's really good. He's got a flow that basically uses the geo positioning. So that when he's out on his walk, it prompts him when to open up the Pokemon game to log in and have a battle, because it knows where certain things are in the world that relate to the Pokemon world. And the way it does that is it rewrites its trigger every time he gets to a new geolocation, which is basically what I wanted to do. I wanted to rewrite the flow every time. So to do that, we've got to go deeper. We've got to get into the definition. So as I said, parameters aren't changing, actions aren't changing. We just need to look at updating the triggers. So we're going to be updating the path and the folder path. And basically, we're going to rebuild our definition from scratch. Copying from the original, updated from the original, copied from the original, and updated because it's just something else to update. So I learned an awful lot doing this, as this was really probably my first proper production flow. And the run history is your absolute friend. And that's because we can do what we did just now, is we can view the data. So we can take that flow definition, we can pump it into something like code where we can see, we can apply proper JSON rules to it. And you can see in this screenshot that you get some nice erroring in the window that says, hey, there's a problem here in this JSON file. So that really, really helped me when I was coming into actually building this from scratch. So that's the end of the slides. What I'm going to do is I'm going to step right out of my comfort zone here now. And we're actually going to build this completely from scratch. Now, we've got 45 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. I know we've got arrows. We're going to ignore that. And so we're going to create a brand new flow. And I'm going to use instant again and manually trigger a flow. And create. So for our manually triggered flow, we're going to have a few inputs. And these are basically the keys that we're going to be pulling in from our HTTP trigger. So I've got the site URL, our flow name, the list name that we want to attach to, and the folder path. So the folder path is important if someone renames the list on you, because you'll find if you look in like the documents folder in SharePoint, its actual folder path name is shared documents rather than documents. So once we've got that, we need to go and get some SharePoint bits. So we're going to do a get lists and libraries. There we go, get lists. And do a custom name. I just need to find my file that's got all the folders. There we go. Cool. So what I will say is I'm running this as a service account. So the connections for this are running as a service account. As part of our deployment, we're giving the Flow service account ownership of this site so that we can do things in there. If we don't do that, we get a very quick failure. And then we just need to get some list details. Oh, I've done this around the wrong way, sorry. That should have been, I'll swap them now. Get all lists and libraries. Now, there we go. It's all right. I've already done the get list bit. I need to send HTTP request. This is the problem when you rename the steps and you think, hang on, which actual connector was that? So this is my site URL that we're using. So we're going to do a custom value and pull that from the manual trigger. We can do get, and the URI for this one is _API/web/list/get by title. So if anyone's familiar with the SharePoint API, this is basically just a standard REST query. And this is where we're going to then pass in the list name. Make sure you finish this properly. Else with the semicolons, it doesn't like it. Then we need to add a couple of headers for this, just to make sure that it's happy to accept what we want to pass it. So application /JSON OData equals no metadata. There's plenty of blogs showing you how to do these kind of calls to SharePoint. Save regularly and often. So at this point, if we want to, let's just do a quick run and test on this one. So our site URL is that one. The list name will be documents, and the folder name will be shared documents for this one. So I'm happy that that's, oh, that failed.
Your URI is wrong, I think.
It is wrong, isn't it?
That closing single quote, the single quote in the closing bracket.
Did that take it out?
Sure, you typed it. Sure, you typed it.
You did type it.
I did type it, didn't I?
You did, but I've had it do that to me lots of times.
There we go. Right, it's done it. So I'm happy. I'm not going to run that again. I'm happy that's going to go through. So what I would do here is I rename this now, because in a minute we're going to want the output of this. And if you've got send underscore HTTP underscore blah blah blah, it just gets horrendous. So I'm going to rename this one get list details. So okay, so that sets up our SharePoint. So we're going to do get flow. So we've got to type Power Automate in to get the Power Automate management connector that we're looking for, and we want get flow. So I'm doing this all in my main environment, and I already have a flow set up, which is called a send email on new item. That's nice and simple. So our next action then is going to be create flow. Oh, but if we just type create flow in there, we don't get that. So Power Automate and create flow. So we're going to create in our main environment. Our display name is going to be something dynamic. You can do something fancy with this, but we're going to do dynamic, and then we're going to pull in from the manually trigger. We're going to pull in our flow name, which I went past. There we go. And then for our flow definition, we're going to come back to that in a minute. We're going to set the started state. And because I'm copying the flow, I don't actually need to change my references at all. So I can pull in from the get flow just the connection references. So you'll notice that I shrunk this down to an array, and I'm just passing the connection references through. So at this point, that's our create flow ready. So we just need to now build this flow definition. This is where it starts to get a little bit interesting, because we saw earlier that if we just drop in the new flow definition, this flow starts to interfere with the flow that we're trying to deploy. And that gets a bit problematical. So what we actually need to do is start to compose our flow bit by bit. So we're using the compose data operation, and our input to this one is effectively the outline schema that I showed you in code. So hopefully that posts in nicely from Word. Yes, it has. So this is our JSON object that we're going to build up, and we're going to replace these content sections as we go. So this is going to be our compose flow definition, and how we name these is quite important as we go to build up as we move on. So we know parameters and actions aren't changing. So that's parameters and that's actions. So we can pretty much copy those straight from the flow. So again, we're going to use compose again. And for this one, we're going to build a bit of an expression. And I'm going to cheat because I have got these all in a Word document next to me, so I don't get them wrong. And what we're doing here, I'll just scroll back, is we're using basically the way to walk through a JSON body. So we're going for body get flow, we're going to the properties object, the definition, the parameters, and pulling that in. So if we just switch back quickly to our JSON, we're going to parameters. Sorry, no, we're not. Which one did I go to? Properties, yeah, sorry, properties, definition, parameters, and we're just grabbing the whole parameters object. So again, this is going to rename to compose new parameters. So that's literally just taken that entire parameters block there and drop that into the compose object. So we're going to do the same now for actions. So again, compose. And in this one, we're going to drop effectively the same. We're going to go into expression. And again, we're getting the body of the get flow. We're going into the properties, the definition, and then the actions block. And rename that to compose new actions. Okay. So the next compose then is our trigger. And this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, because the trigger is what we actually want to update. So we have to do what we're doing with the flow definition and basically build it up bit by bit. So let me just rename this so we don't lose track of where we are, because if I lose track, I'm sure you guys will. So compose new trigger. And we're basically going to take the trigger from our current flow schema for now. So if I just go back to here, and what we're actually interested in is the bit between those two brackets. So that's our trigger. So we're just going to drop that in there. So a couple of things have happened there. We've started to see the encodes are being actioned straight away because we've dropped them in there. So I'm like, okay. So I need to look at some of these and rewrite them. So in there, we basically need our site URL. So if we just quickly go back to the trigger, you can see in here that we've got a double encode URI here. So the reason for that is we're passing in a standard URL. So when we encode this the first time, it encodes the slashes, etc., into % number. The problem is we're then passing in a % sign, which itself has to be encoded again because we don't want Flow to unencode it too quickly. So we have to do this double encode problem. So to do that, we use an expression and we use the encode URI component, open bracket, and then we do encode URI component again, open bracket. So we're operating the first encode and then we're encoding the results of that. Hopefully that makes sense. And then what we're after is trigger body, which is one of our pop-ups here. Let me just move this right a bit if we can. And then in for our trigger body, we're after one of the parameters. Now this is where it's a bit horrible, because the parameter I want is called text. And this is from the trigger body. And we're like, but hang on, I called this site URL. But did we? If I just go back to our manually trigger a flow, yeah, we definitely called it site URL. But if we look at the code, and this is a nice handy, I love this peak code feature. There's our title, site URL, but the property name is text. And the next one is text_1. And the next one is text_2. I don't believe we can change those, and it's horrible. So you just have to be aware. When I was first looking at this, I thought the sample text I was reading meant this is a sample and replace it, and I kept replacing it with site URL, and it just kept throwing a wobbly and didn't like it. And it wasn't until I came and looked at the code view and I realized actually it's the property name for the flow object, not the property name that we're passing through that it wanted. So once you understand that, that actually then makes a lot more sense in this expression window. And we do pretty much the same for the list ID. So it's an encode URI, and then in this case it's trigger body, and then open brackets text _1, which is just horrible. So excellent. So we've got that. And then the last bit is our folder path. We don't need to worry. We're not passing anything in. I've got control over the HTTP call, so I know I'm just going to pass a name that's sensible and doesn't have any horrible things. You could URI encode this if you wanted to, just in case someone put underscores and hyphens or anything that it might not like. But in this case, I'm just dropping in. Scroll down. Come on, scroll down there. I'm just going to drop in the folder path. Oh, so it's done that thing where it drops it right at the bottom where I don't want it. I want it there. There we go. So brilliant. And so at this point we think, okay, so I've put all my dynamic information in, but I've got a big red on the flow checker, and it doesn't like my JSON. And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to work out what I'd done wrong. And it wasn't really until I had this conversation with John, and he said, you know, basically you can't just drop it in because of what the flow editor's trying to do. So John, bless him, did want me to sign up and get a subscription to his Flow Studio product, which allows you to do this without having to do a lot of the messing around that I'm doing. But I'm only a poor MVP and couldn't afford that. So I decided to try and find a free way of doing things. So basically, we've got to rebuild this trigger properly. Oh, actually, that's one of the reasons why my flow is moaning there. Have we got a different error now? No, still valid JSON. So you'll get a few different errors coming up. I was getting things like uncompleted string constant and weird errors. And in the end, it was a case of, look, let's just get rid of everything in here and let's start from scratch with the trigger. So here we go. Right, just copy this across. So what we start with in our new trigger now is a much cut down version. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what was originally in, if I come back to this one, the host connection. And interestingly, I had to change this. What I really worked out was that some of these ones with the @ which basically says to Flow, you need to replace this value. These are what are causing the problem. Strangely, the split on didn't, because all of my workflows are passing null to that anyway. So the fact that that returns an empty value doesn't matter. But these ones all try and return a value. So to work around this problem, we've got to push in new values. So what I had to do was work out what's the kind of the lowest common denominator of the JSON that I could get away with. And effectively, it was the host, the query, and the path, and the authentication. So if we go back to our thing, we've got our host, our path, our query, and authentication. So what we've got to do here is basically compose new sections for those. So we'll start with the compose action for the hosts. I'm going to rename that compose new hosts, and the input for this one is fairly straightforward because we're going to use that same walking the JSON expression again. So we're back to our get flow, and we're doing, I hope everyone can see that text okay, given that you've seen it so many times. I'm assuming no one's shouted and saying I can't read it, so we'll keep going. So we're doing body get flow, properties definition, so that takes us into the definition. And then we're walking triggers, when a file is created, inputs, host. So if we go back to the JSON, we're going to into our parameter, into our definition, triggers, when a file is created, host. And we're basically grabbing the contents of that object. So that will leave us with that host block. Okay, so we're then going to do the same for the next one, which is actions. Oh, actually, no, it's not. It's compose new path we want to do next. So path gets a little bit interesting because the path, when we look at it, is where we've got this encode URI component. And we know that if we start messing around with this straight away, it breaks the definition. So we're going to, before we do the path, we're actually going to encode our list ID and site URL. So I did this through variables last time. I guess you could just use a compose as well. So this is going to be my site URL string. And the value for this one is now going to be the encode URI. Double. With the trigger body and the text. So that will give us our site URL encoded. And let's just, good practice, rename them so we know exactly what's going on. I got into a very bad habit when I first started playing with Flow of just leaving these all the same, and you'd have get list 1, get list 2, get list 3, and you go back to try and troubleshoot that and it's impossible. So that's the site URL. And we'll do initialize our list ID. Again, this is the encode URI component, encode URI component, trigger body, and this time text _1. So meaningful. And let's rename that one. List ID. Great. So we've got our list ID, so we can start to build our path. I've just realized actually that's not the trigger body at all. Sorry, this one's slightly different. We actually don't get the list ID from the trigger body because we go and look that up. No one spotted my deliberate mistake. So what we actually get this from is the body of our get list details. So this is why I said about it's really hard to see on this window. One too many. There we go. So body. So we're calling for the body of the get list details action. And out of that, we want the ID. So that's the make an HTTP request to SharePoint. We're saying what's the list ID basically of this list that we've asked for. So that's our list ID. So in our path now we can drop the actual path. So what that looks like is something like this. I'm just going to make, rather than have those come from my text, I'm going to do them properly. So our path is basically inputs. Actually, I need to check that one. That's not. This is the problem with copying the peak code. Our compose new path is actually going to look like this, and we're going to pass in the encoded site URL, and in there the encoded list ID. That makes sense, hopefully. So that's the path. And then the last one, if I look back in our trigger, what we've got, we've done hosts, we've done path, we need queries. So let's add another compose for queries. How are we doing for time? We've got 15 minutes. We're doing well. I did panic that this was going to take me an hour and a half to build. Compose new queries. And in this one, we're basically going to be passing in the folder path again into a JSON block. And just to make sure that that's not pasting in, I'm going to take that straight from, this gets a bit longer towards the end, doesn't it? There we go, folder path. So I'm happy that that's coming from, and that's a proper JSON block. Okay, and then the last block we need now is our compose new authentication. So another compose action. And again, we're just going to walk the body of the previous get flow and pass in the expression that walks down through the inputs and grabs authentication as a block. Cool. So at that point, we've got all of the elements now to drop in here. So we've got our host entry. So I'll carefully delete out the chevrons. And from our dynamic content, we now want the outputs of new hosts. And then for path, the outputs of path. For queries, that's my queries one. Queries, and then authentication. Authentication. So you'll notice that in some of them I've left the speech. I think I've done these on the wrong ones actually. So we'll just come back to here and just check. So if you're passing in an object, you don't need the speech marks around it. If you're, however, passing in the path, I do need the speech marks around it. So queries, yeah, so it's path and authentication that I need my speech marks. So path I did, but I didn't do speech marks around authentication. So that should work. Cool. So a good sign here is if I save it, oh, okay, flow definition, that actually makes sense. So it's not throwing an error on our trigger. It's not throwing an error on the flow. It's here that's actually moaning. So let's complete the flow definition. So again, we've got parameters, triggers, actions, and a description. Well, I'm just going to put a nice London PUG flow demo. So for my parameters, again, I'm dropping objects in now, so I definitely don't need my speech marks. And I want the output of parameters, which should be further down. So there's compose new parameters. There's triggers. So that should be up the top here, compose new trigger. And then there's actions. Compose new actions. Ooh. And then the last one is the output of our compose flow definition. And save. Now the big question here, I'm going to have a drink because I'm thirsty. So flow check is good. We've got no errors. It's not screaming at us. One thing I will say is I rebuilt this on Monday night just to make sure that it was still building. And I spent 2 hours because I built exactly as you've seen and it didn't work. And the reason was I used initialize a variable instead of compose for the flow definition. And I don't know the difference between a string variable and a composed block of data, but it just wouldn't work with initialize variable for the flow definition. So I had to use compose. I'm guessing it's probably to do with the fact that how it structures the JSON data in the string object. Don't know. I'm sure someone like Keith will be able to tell me. But anyway, at this point, I'm feeling good about this. So we're going to hit test. I'll perform the trigger action again, just so that I've got complete control over what's going on. So we're going to drop in the URL of the site that I want to use. So this URL that we're using has just got, it's basically a SharePoint team site. It's just got a document library and a few documents in. It's got no flows attached currently. We've already got the word dynamic in there, so let's have London PPUG test. So our list name is documents. Our folder path is shared documents. Moment of truth. Oh, flow run failed. What didn't it like? Okay, so it doesn't like the property ID coming out of the get list. I'm sure there's a good reason for that. So we can, I'll get list details. So for one thing, have I got that name right? Get list details. Yeah. So let's go back to the URI there. Fairly straightforward format, this one. So it's body, get list details, ID. So I'm thinking it's probably the capitalization on the ID. So let's just say OK to that. Let's go back to our failure. And this is really where the run history helps you, because you can go into get list details and we can have a look at what's come out. So we can take this XML body. XML. I asked for JSON. Oh, okay. And there's why. There's a problem in my header. So I'm not expecting XML back. I'm expecting JSON back. So straight away we can see where our problem is. So we can go back to there. Go to the get list details, and that should have been a semicolon. That was a fat finger moment. So let's try that again. Let's go back to the test. This time I'm going to use the data from the one that just failed, because I'm happy that that was all incorrectly. That's a good sign. We haven't failed straight away. Oh, success. It's a miracle. Literally is a miracle. Thank you. So, okay, so I've gone back to my flows, and we can see we now have a flow that I haven't created myself. We have a dynamic flow. So if we go into this flow, we haven't got any errors saying that there's a problem with the flow. If we go into the flow itself, we can see this is the when a file is created. We can see our site address. We can see the profile. We're getting the profile, and we're sending an email. So this is all the data that we had in that flow. So really, the moment of truth is, does it work? So this is the site. Let me just grab a random document. So I've just dropped in a document. And if I stay in this view, we should hopefully get an alert that says, hey, an email's arrived. But I'm impatient, so we'll come to this screen instead. How often does it rise? Every 5 minutes on a trigger. This is probably a good point to say, is there any questions here? Have we lost anyone?
Still all there.
Yeah, I think we're still alive and kicking, man.
Oh, look at that. So it triggered. So our dynamic flow has triggered properly when we've uploaded a file. I was hoping to get an alert for the email that says, hey, it's run. But yeah, so if we look at our flows now, so this was the one we built. When we ran that, it deployed London PPUG test. And when we dropped a document into the file library, it's properly run. It's been triggered by the file. We can see the details of the files are just to show you that we weren't lying. And that was the document there. Set up instructions. It did a get profile, and it sent me an email. So important. Now it hasn't actually come through to my mobile yet, has it? Oh, yes, it has. There we go. So just to show, the email came through. So I'm quite happy. So actually, I'm about 10 minutes ahead of schedule there. I was anticipating having to do a lot more troubleshooting, but it actually went quite well. So I guess really at that point, is there any questions on that?
You got big balls to do this live, man. Well done.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no questions, but like my mind.
Yeah. So it was definitely a lot of head banging on the table to get to this.
How long did it actually take you to get that all working, Paul? Because I think my brain is still encoding a URI somewhere.
So actually, to be fair, it was probably about a day and a half of solid effort. Yeah. If you took into the bits of taking a break for an hour away from the computer to go and kick something around the garden, and to say that there was some alcohol drunk when I did get it working, it would not be an understatement.
Why do you think all my stuff works? Come on.
Sorry?
Why do you think all my stuff works?
Alcohol. Unfortunately, I've run out of alcohol and I can't get to the supermarket till the weekend. So I'm on water and gin. There might be gin in it.
Yeah, as long as it works.
There are so many uses for that, being able to just automate that deployment of a flow. So, as you say, as part of a site design, to actually just create all of that stuff and generate it. There's so much potential there.
This is the thing. So this is going with a government inspectorate, and basically every time they generate an inspection, they have to have a team, and the team's got to have a certain amount of data, and part of that includes the flow that basically goes off and sets up the permissions and stuff like that on other things, not just on the SharePoint. You know, we can control the SharePoint site nice and easily through the site design. The problem we had is the other things that go off. So there is a bunch of CRM stuff being done behind this, and we can control all of that from the flow. But to do that, we've got to be able to trigger the flow. So we need this flow to deploy the flow that then triggers off all that stuff. So the flow that we're actually deploying in production is a lot more complicated than that simple email flow. So I'll say there is a lot more steps in building up through those compose actions. I wouldn't be lying if I said we've probably got about 50 compose actions in the production one. Just to build up. But once you understand where you need to break that JSON down, actually, the way I've done it and the way I showed you there by basically building up the parent of construction and then dropping in above it the things that you need to add, it helps you keep your head around actually what am I building in JSON here. Someone did say to me when I tweeted this out and I blogged about it, he said, well, why didn't you just use like string replace? And I'll be honest, to string replace that would probably be quite simple. To string replace what we're doing in production, I would not want to troubleshoot that if it goes wrong. I think this approach for me makes it easier to see what's going on. You know, the fact we can name each of our compose steps. You know, we can see which compose step they're then feeding into. It just, for me, it makes it more readable.
Yeah, being able to debug it is absolutely crucial if you're going to have 50 replace or 50 compose steps in it.
Yeah,
being able to identify where it's gone wrong and why.
That's it. Yeah, and I must admit, yeah, I love the fact that you can go in at any stage of the flow of the test and see what went wrong. I would love to be able to make those windows bigger, but it's just as easy to cut and paste that into into code, and at least then code applies some JSON rules to it, so you can actually see where the error is. You know, when you've got a JSON file open in Flow, you get these lovely red errors where there's a problem. So it makes that so much easier when it comes to debugging. You don't get that kind of IntelliSense in the Flow editor. So that really, really helped. So IntelliSense may come one day, but
as you say, I mean, but using code for any JSON in any flow, you know, I'm sure Laura would agree that if you're actually building adaptive cards or, you know, anything, this always helps.
Did you guys turn on the new experimental features to get the bigger box?
Yeah, the experimental features would help you editing those flows.
Yeah, do you know what? I couldn't remember how to turn them on, and we'd already started. So
I will say it's as buggy as hell when it comes to giving you the suggestions. Sometimes it gives you IntelliSense in there, and sometimes it just doesn't.
Right.
And sometimes when you're editing long bits of JSON and stuff, it will jump you to a different place.
Yeah,
just
so I
to
found
help.
that a couple of times where it like you'll go to insert a dynamic string and it puts it at the bottom, not where you had your cursor.
I'm sure Peter will interject. I've got this wrong. The way I solved that was save. Every time you interject a piece of JSON, save, because then it seems to reset it.
Yeah, because I mean, you saw that when I did the initial path for getting the list API, it cut off. And I definitely did type it because I had that problem when I did the test. So I knew I made a point of typing it to make sure it was there after I'd added the dynamic field, and it removed it. So, and I think Anti-Pounder was tweeting about that the other day about it removing stuff that he'd been putting in. So
when I've been doing videos, I've even got evidence that I typed it in, and it wasn't there afterwards. Yeah. Then
I'm recording this session, Laura.
Pardon?
This session is recorded, Laura. So we recorded it this time. It's all there.
Yeah, but yeah. So we've got the proof that Paul typed it in.
Yep.
But it is
awesome.
The new version is very much in preview. The new version of being able to type in the new experience.
Yep.
So, hey.
And we have to take previews with I was demoing today. I've been training a company with Teams, and I was demoing the live captioning in meetings, and I was very clear to point out it's a preview feature because it's still learning, and it has some interesting results when it comes to accents and people that mumble and things like that. So sometimes those live captions are quite hilarious, but it's a preview feature.
It hates South Africans.
And Glaswegians.
Excellent. Well, I think that was fantastic, Paul. Cool. So I think we'd planned to kind of take a break at about 5 to 8 so that we can all duck outside and do our bit for the NHS, and then
I was going to stay inside and do my bit for the NHS.
Just shout out the window.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Are we clapping naked tonight, or is that next week?
After you, Keith.
Don't tempt him. So I think we're planning on coming back at about 8:05 when Matt is going to wow us with Power Apps to jazz up SharePoint list forms. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Fantastic. See you then.
Yep. Time to take a break and grab a drink in time for Matt. Oh, I like the t-shirt, Matt.
I've got a shed load of custom ones on the way. So this is one that I got sent by the Flownaut team. So check out the ones that I'll be wearing hopefully over the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. So we'll resume in about 15 minutes time.
Cheers all.
Okay. Cool.
All right. See you in a bit.
There we go. That's the one time I've seen the neighbours again for the week.
It makes for good mixing with the neighbours, though, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I've met more neighbours during lockdown than I've met in 20 years.
We thought that as well, because people are just walking everywhere. We look out the window going, who are they? Apparently
but people say hello. It's really weird. Out on walks.
Oh yeah, out on walks though. It's everywhere around where I am, the nice quiet little paths that we used to go on and not see anybody, they're crammed with people now.
Yeah, our canal, the canal that local to us was a very popular walk, lots of people, but is now just too crowded.
Yeah, it's contradictory, isn't it? Yeah, nice quiet places now become too busy, whereas the centre of town will be empty.
Paul, did you put a link to your blog post up on a slide?
I didn't, so thank you very much for tweeting that out.
Yeah, Paul's done a really good blog post on this.
Basically, it was that demo on paper form.
That must have been one of those blog posts. It's an absolute epic to write.
Yeah, did take a while. I had to basically go back and recreate everything from scratch to capture the screen.
Yeah.
That's why I mostly do videos now.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even then, when it all goes horribly wrong in the video and you have to go and re-record, no, it's hard work. Think we're back?
I reckon so. Over to you, Matt.
Cool, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Obviously, I was down at the last user group that we had in London, and I faked a blue screen. If you do see a blue screen this time, it's definitely not planned. So, yeah, please bear with me. But what we're going to be looking at tonight are how we can use Power Apps to really transform the experience that we have with SharePoint list forms. So I like to combine a lot of my presentations with my new love, which is Power Apps and Power Automate, with my first love, which was SharePoint. So let's see what we can do with that. So I'll start off really by introducing myself. My name's Matt Weston. I'm the managing director of a small consultancy in the Midlands called Vantage 365. I spend a lot of my time really doing consulting and training around the whole Office 365 and Microsoft 365 stack. But I also spend a lot of my time working in different elements of the community. So I run 2 user groups. I run the Office 365 and SharePoint user group in the West Midlands. I also run the Black Country Power Apps and Power Automate user group, which was mentioned earlier on. And the next session for that is the 12th of May. I will post the link if you want to register that.
That'd be that blue screen then, wouldn't it?
I was going to say, I thought that was just me, but obviously not.
He shouldn't tempt fate like this, should he?
He shouldn't. That was an impressive
Are we all singing to Penny again?
Yeah, definitely. We're all singing to Penny. Let
me message him and see what's going on. It's the problem with combining your old love and your new love, isn't it? It's never going to work out well. Oh, he's gone.
Yeah, I've just sent him a text.
Nice. I like it, Paul. Is everybody aware of how to do that?
No.
I'm sure there's a lot of blogs on it now.
I think so.
I'll have to look. He's lost power.
Oh no.
That's demo God's extreme.
Isn't it just? That is a little painful for him. So he joked
down a runner.
He joked about the blue screen.
He
mixed his old love and his new love. I mean, that just can't be good,
Yeah.
can it?
Yeah. Tempting fate.
So has he lost power to everything then?
I've never known him swear before.
Fair enough. Anybody got any? Oh yeah, Paul, I need to remove you from my screen, mate. You're distracting me.
Oh, that's just scary, Paul.
What's really scary is that filter actually makes me look like my sister.
Is that better for you or your sister? I don't know.
I think it's probably better for me than her.
Cool. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask about anything Power Platform that we can help with? Anybody fancy doing an ad hoc presentation?
Have you got something up your sleeve, Keith?
Oh, I've always got something up my sleeve.
Yeah, but can you share it?
That's why I carefully said sleeve.
Yeah, I mean, we can do some bits, I suppose.
Oh, wait a minute. Matt's power has just come back.
Oh, has it?
He's waiting for his router to power back up.
Oh, crumbs. He's had a proper spike. You
Yeah.
know what that was? Everyone's turned the kettle on when they came back in for clapping for the NHS. Oh, right, we're doing that now. Right, let's get brew on.
That radio would be out for 3 hours.
That's the third person today that I've heard have a power outage, though. Slightly worrying.
My God, you really couldn't make it up, could you?
Welcome back.
I like that last time it was a wind up and this time it's for real. It's like genius.
It was. I couldn't even write that. That was amazing. Yeah, so I'll carry on introducing myself as I was promoting myself.
Is this where we need to fake a blue screen? What? Do we need to get a blue screen shot?
Yeah, I haven't got that this time, unfortunately. So let's share my screen. That would be quite helpful. Okay, so we should be back where we left off. Okay, perfect. So I was really singing the praises about the Black Country Power Apps and Power Automate user group just before I rudely got interrupted. So the next session is the 12th of May. I will post the link later if you are interested in signing up for that one as well. Even if it's just to go and see how the results of a really cool flow, which I've got running behind the background, managing registration. But you'll learn some really cool things on the night as well. But proudly, I'm a Flownaut. So I like to help out when I can on the in the Power Automate community, and I'm also a business applications MVP. What I also like to share is that I actually live a double life. So as well as being an IT consultant, I'm also an Army reservist. So I spend a decent amount of time each month in a cheap green suit, winning the wars with Office 365. So generally what I do in military life is also the same as what I do in civil. If you do have any questions or if you want to reach out to me at any point after this session, please do feel free to reach out. You can reach me on Twitter. I have got a YouTube channel where I post my Flow Bite series, which just help you get over some of those issues with Flow. You can reach out on LinkedIn, or you can catch my blogs on blog.weston365.com. So what am I going to be talking about in this session? Really is how we can address the out-of-the-box experience for interacting with lists and libraries. It's one of those things that we always want to do. So SharePoint is okay. The experience is okay out of the box. It does what we need, but we always need to take it that little bit further. And generally this is where, especially in SharePoint Online, Power Apps is really coming to the fore to allow us to actually take the out-of-the-box experience, improve it, so we can make it more manageable for our users and also more engaging. And we'll be looking at two ways in which we can do that within Power Apps. The first, we'll be looking at the app approach. We'll look at very quickly this one because it's quite common, how we can use an actual app, how we can then use that within SharePoint. But we're going to quickly move on from that. We're going to look at how we can actually improve the list forms themselves, how we can actually interact with our Power Apps without leaving the context of the actual list or library that we're in at the time. But it's always worthwhile having a very quick look, first of all, at what happened in the past, because this isn't a new requirement. Ever since we've been using SharePoint, the requirement has always been, well, we want to use SharePoint, but we don't want it to look like SharePoint, or we want it to do more. And there's always been a couple of ways that we've been able to do that. Can anybody remember any ways that we did this in the past?
InfoPath.
Yeah,
JS link.
Custom master pages.
Yeah, custom master pages, InfoPath, all the things that really made any SharePoint administrator absolutely shudder when their users got their hands on it. So SharePoint Designer was the common one because it was really easy to install SharePoint Designer. We could go in and open the site, we could open the list, and we could generally clone or create a new list form. Or what happened most of the time is someone would go in and edit the out-of-the-box list forms. They would break it, they would end up killing the list. And anarchy generally ensued. But it was one of the ways that we were able to make these types of customizations to make our list forms look slightly different or behave slightly differently to what they did by default. But then we also had InfoPath. Now, I have got massive scars around InfoPath. I'm allergic to it. I won't touch it now at all. But it was generally another application that we could use to create even more in-depth even more interactive forms that we could then deploy into SharePoint, provided we got the enterprise licensing to go with it. And we could then use that as our interface for interacting with our list. Now, that some of the older and bolder guys on here who have actually used InfoPath have probably got their own war stories around this. But you quite often have people trying to connect out to different data sources, to web services, bringing it all into one place. And then trying to move it somewhere else and finding out it was actually quite difficult to port these things around, or actually then for somebody else to come on board and start customizing. Both of these really don't lend themselves particularly well to the modern approach that we have within SharePoint. So they're both very classic driven. Both can still be used, but there are now nicer ways in order to embrace the new things that we get with SharePoint Online. So when we talk about SharePoint Design and InfoPath, we're very much talking about old-fashioned technology. It's still there. It still has a time. It's never going to come back in terms of finalization. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's in the past and it's gone. So what do we do now? We actually look to Power Apps in order to make these customizations in order to do exactly what we've done with SharePoint Designer and InfoPath in the past. So what we're going to do is look at, first of all, how we can do this, but we're also going to look at the types of things that Power Apps supports, how it can be used, and some of the little gotchas that I found as I've actually been going through and using this in deployed scenarios. So first of all, I'm going to just quickly run through what is supported in terms of Power Apps and in terms of the SharePoint data field types that you've got. So obviously there are a number of different data types that you can use. Some are supported, some aren't, some are partially supported. So for example, a single line of text, multiple lines of text, obviously very much supported because it's so easy to translate into Power Apps. Location, as an example, isn't yet supported by Power Apps. And when I say supported, it means that I can't interact with that field other than read it from inside a Power App. So location is relatively new, so we're still waiting for that to come on board in terms of being something that we can then use. But there are other ways of being able to interact with that, such as calling out to different web services or bringing mapping information in from Bing Maps into your Power App to almost replicate that functionality. And for the most part, a lot of the fields are actually supported. So even lookups are supported and they work relatively well. I'm not going to get into the whole conversation about should I be using lookups within SharePoint versus should I be using relationships in CDS. That's a beer in a bar type of discussion. But lookups are supported. Interesting, what I found when I was going through and double checking all of these this morning to make sure this slide was still correct, is that hyperlinks I've put down as partially supported, because when a hyperlink using the SharePoint, using a form control gets put into Power Apps, it will only allow me to update one part of the hyperlink field, and that's the actual URL part. When we look at the field in SharePoint, we have the ability to define the URL and also the display text that goes over the top of it. So whilst it's supported, it's only partially supported because I can only update the URL. Managed metadata I also found quite interesting in terms of the way that is again partially supported. There's no control directly out of the box that allows me to really replicate what I can do with managed metadata in terms of having a hierarchy, but I'll show you how it's actually structured when we go into Power Apps in a moment, so you can start to have a think about how you could replicate this in different ways. And this is something I'm working on as a component at the moment, so to actually allow us to interact with managed metadata down to a number of levels, so we can have that hierarchical approach. So, like Paul, I'm going to spend most of my time actually doing live demos. Now, given the fact that I couldn't even get through PowerPoint without actually having some sort of failure, I'm not holding much hope out for my live demos, but we'll see how it goes. So,
I'm sorry if I used all the luck up, mate.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. You've took it all. So let's actually go and have a look at the app approach first of all. So I've got my SharePoint site. I'll keep an eye on this timer. This is actually how much time I've got left to keep entertaining you before we have a PowerPoint. But I've got a holiday requests list here. And on my list, it's a very, very basic list, purely just for this demonstration. And it's got a number of different data types on there. So if I just go and have a look at new for a moment, I've got some text fields, I've got some date fields, I've got a choice, and so on. So I've got some basic things that I can do. Now, the app approach really means that I'm going to create a Power App which sits outside of SharePoint. Therefore, it's a fully fledged Power App that I can then edit, I can share, and so on. And there's two ways that we can obviously do this. The first is I can go out to Power Apps, I can go and create a new app, and I can then bring it into, I can then customize it by adding forms and doing all the good stuff that we can do within Power Apps. Or what I can do, and this is just really to illustrate the fact that you can do this quite quickly if you just want a very quick demonstration of what Power Apps can do. You can go to Power Apps and you can create an app. Let's call this my holiday request app. And let's go and create that. So while that's creating, what that's going to do is obviously look at the fields that I've got within SharePoint. It's going to go away and it's going to generate a mobile, an app on a mobile canvas that I can effectively then use almost immediately without any further customizations, because it will contain all of my CRUD operations. It will allow me to search, it will allow me to allow me to read, allow me to update, create, and so on. And this is one of those apps that I really just use to illustrate the fact that you can create a Power App that's connected to a SharePoint list. It seems that people, when they demonstrate this, get really excited. And everyone except the customer gets excited because it's not the nicest looking of apps. But for a general POC, you know what, it's fine. I can go and show things, I can save things, I can write those back to my list. And from there, if I want to, I can go and make all my customizations. I am graphically challenged, by the way, so please don't criticize my design work too much. So if I wanted to go and insert a picture in, then I can obviously do that. So I can go and insert images, whatever it might be, and I create my app. I'm just going to go and save that for a moment and publish that. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is old hat now. So I've created my app. And if I want to use that, especially within the confines of SharePoint, then I need to go and actually get my app. So let's go back to Power Apps for a moment. Being blind, so let's open that in a new tab. Let's go and grab the basic details for that app. which let's just change my. There's my holiday request app. I'm just going to grab the details. I'm going to go and grab my app ID. And then I'm going to put it into SharePoint. So this is generally the way a lot of people really start to tackle trying to put Power Apps into SharePoint. So let's go and find my Power Apps app. Let's go and add my ID. And effectively what I'm doing is shoehorning a Power App into a SharePoint page. Now that sometimes will work. Especially if I don't necessarily want people going to the list to go and interact with the list in different ways, like looking at different views and so on. And my app will work. Doesn't always necessarily look the best, but it will work. So now, but what the big issue with that is, like I've already said, if I go back to my holiday requests, I've always got an additional way of going and interacting with my list. I can still go to here, I can still go to new, and yes, I can change, I can try and block that out in different ways, but I've now got two ways of being able to enter data into that list. So that is obviously the app approach. The good thing with that is I can really control who uses the app, but on the flip side, I have to manage the app permissions, I have to manage the SharePoint permissions, and so there's quite a lot of admin overhead around that. But yeah, we've seen all this before. Yeah, so let's actually go look at how we can improve, physically improve the lists themselves inside of the context of an actual list itself. So I call this the list form approach. So within my list, and exactly the same applies to the libraries now, I've got my Power Apps bar up here, and we've just seen that I can go and create an app, and away it will go, and it will go and create it for me. But what I've got below that is I've got the ability to customize forms. So I'm going to quickly click on that and let it go away and start thinking about what it wants to present. So from here, I am now, again, I'm going through this whole process of creating an app, but this time I'm going to make some very basic customizations, and then I'm going to publish this back. I'm just going to see where this then appears within SharePoint. So like I say, I am graphically challenged, so the amount of customization that I'm going to do is I'm going to put a label up here, and let's go and just call that a label form header. I'm going to call this request, and let's just do something very, very fancy with it. I'm going to make it red, and I'm going to give it some white text. Okay, so I've made a basic customization, so you can really take this as far as you want, as far as you want to, in terms of making this look and feel the way that you want. Let's just go and save that, and I'm going to publish. So let's publish back to SharePoint. So I'm going to go back to SharePoint now, because in all intents and purposes, I've just created an app. I've made some basic customizations to it. However, where do I now see this? So if I now go to go to new, rather than seeing the out of the box experience now that I get with SharePoint, I'm now seeing my app that I've just created as a list form. So it sits within the blade that appears on the right hand side. And it's important to remember that, because that means that's all the real estate that I've got to play with in terms of the width of this app. But I can then make all the different customizations. I can make it look fancy, and it then immediately gives me that nicer engagement from an end user point of view. But there are a couple of little things that really niggle me about this. The first is that no matter what my regional settings are in my SharePoint site, no matter what my date formats are or my regional settings are within the browser itself, for some reason, this always appears when I've got the default date as American format. Even when I change and select my date, it still appears in American format. So this is just one of those little things that you always need to remember to do if you're using dates within your apps. And again, it comes down to just some of those basic little modifications that you can make when you're actually using this type of app. So how do I fix that first of all before I go on and start doing some more advanced stuff with the actual app itself? So I'm just going to quickly duplicate this so I don't have to keep going backwards and forwards, and let's go and customize my form again. So the actual component where all of these controls sits is within a form control, exactly the same as what you would use in a fully blown Power App. So here I have, it's automatically called SharePoint Form 1. So that is a form. It's automatically connected up to my data source for me, and I'll talk about the data source next. So that means that if I need to go and interact with any of these components or controls with any of these cards, then I need to remember that I need to unlock it first of all by going to Advanced, unlocking the change, and don't get yourself into a false sense of security because it displays correctly in Power Apps. Let's go and change the format. And I've tried all ways of doing this. For example, let's show you some of the ways that I've tried it before. So when I talk about the default date, I tried this way. So that will normally format a date in the correct way, but not when it gets back to SharePoint. I tried using ENGB as the actual locale at the end of the language as well, and it still won't work when it gets back to SharePoint. So let's get rid of all that stuff because I don't need that. And a really simple way of being able to fix that is by going to in the properties, going to the format. Where it says here short date, let's just go and change that to day, month, year. And let's do the same for the other one. So the format, and let's again give that day, month, year. Okay, happy days. So let's save that. Let's publish it. Let's come back here and let's give the page a refresh. Another refresh. Obviously, it's still cached. And there we go. So then the dates come through as UK format. So that's just one of those little things that took me a good couple of hours just trying different things to finally get to the bottom of that. Very simple fix, just something for you to add into your arsenal when you're actually doing this type of customization. So let's come back into Power Apps again. Now, obviously there's a connection here to a data source. Now, the difference between creating a standard data source within our within Power Apps, with a fully fledged Power App and within our customization here, is that yes, I've still got my data connection here, but most of my data actually comes through the SharePoint integration objects that I've got up here. And you can see here that it's actually got the data source set to holiday request. So this is where the actual what this whole app is doing in terms of its SharePoint integration. And on this SharePoint integration, so on this data source, which is actually then allowing me to interact with SharePoint, I have a number of properties that I can come into here and start to work with. So for example, yes, I've got data source, I've got on edit, I've got on new, on save, and on view. So that means that each of these events can actually be triggering different formulas, different things at the point that this actually takes place. Now, these I find really important to start using because, for example, if we wanted to dynamically load some data, generally we would do that either on start for the app, or I would do it on visible for the actual screen itself. However, when we're actually using Power Apps within the context of a list, the app only ever loads once until you actually refresh that screen again. So if I am going to create multiple items within a a list without keep going in and out, then, and I want that data to be refreshing each time, then I actually need to do it as part of my SharePoint integration. So what I'm going to do is just really show that. So I'm going to go and drop some labels onto here. So let's call this my on start. And let's just drop another label there. So that's going to be my output. Let's go and copy those. So I'm going to have one for on visible. And let's just go and set that to label on visible output. And let's go and do the same again. But this time I'm going to have one for on new. And let's go and call that my on new. Okay, so what I'm going to do for each of these is go and set a number of variables. So just to really show this, so in my on start, I'm going to set var on start, and I'm going to set this to now, and let's give this to that, and let's go and set that to on start. Let's do the same for on visible on the screen. So that's going to set it on at the point that the screen becomes visible. And let's also go and do the same on new. Effectively, I've got 3 variables all being set at what should be all the same time. On new. So let's save that, and let's go and publish to SharePoint again. My screen, a couple of refreshes, 2 always seems to be the magic number. Okay, 3 this time. Okay, there we go. So, yeah, first time it's loaded, it's set all of those to exactly the same time. So let's go and put some information into here and let's just save that. So I've done one interaction. I then want to go and do the same again. Oh, my on start and my on visible are still exactly the same. So that just really shows that once the app loads, it stays within within the context of that page. It doesn't actually keep reloading. So if you do want things to, so for example, if I wanted my holiday approvals to keep refreshing every time I press new, then I would need to make sure that I do that either on the on new, on edit, or on even on view if I want those dynamically refreshing, just to make sure that I'm always getting the latest information through. So let's go back to my app again, and I'm going to get rid of those now because we don't need those now. And let's make this bigger again. So yes, I can do certain amounts within, I can do certain amounts of customizations within the form, and I can generally have a single form, and I can use formulas to show and hide things. So for example, if this is a new form, then I can go and make this the holiday approval hidden. But what happens if I want to actually use a completely different form experience for each action? So for example, if I want the new form to look one way, I want the edit form to look and behave another way, how can we do that within the context of this app? Now, what I can do is I can create different forms on different screens and basically navigate between them as part of my Power App. So for example, here I have a single form screen, and I'm just going to call this form. Let's go for form new screen. That's going to be my default one. So on my new screen, I want to get some basic information. I want I definitely want a title. I want some from and to dates. I want some comments, but I don't want manager comments or approval comments. And you know what? I'm going to get rid of attachments as well. So I can just come and delete these, or I can come into the actual edit experience for the form itself. And I can remove them. So there's a couple of ways that you can then start to interact with this form. And let's get rid of attachments. So now my form has just the information that I need to allow me to go and create something. Let's go and create another screen, and I'm just going to duplicate this screen. And I'm going to call this form edit screen. And I'm going to go and re-edit the fields here, and I'm going to say that this time I want my holiday approval and I want my manager comments. But you know what? I'm going to make the others read only. So let's go and unlock those. Oh, I've already unlocked it. That's good. Let's go and change my display mode and change it to display mode. Okay, so I can start to make things, so parts of this slightly different depending on what experience we're in. But if I was to save this and publish this right now, the only form that the users are going to see, regardless of whether they're editing or whether they are creating something, is this first form, because that's the default form that we created. So let's go and call that my new form. And let's create this my edit form, just so that we can see 100% that we're actually going to be switching between the forms. But in order to do that, how do I get between the two different screens? So again, that takes place on my SharePoint integration. And I'm going to be using my onNew, my onEdit events. So for example, in my onNew, what does it do? What is it doing by default? Let's get rid of that variable now, because I don't want that. It's instantiating an instance of a new form for SharePoint Form 1. You know, let's go and rename that a little bit, something a little bit more relevant. Form new request, that'll do. So my onNew is instantiating form new request. And just so that we can make sure that we're going to navigate between all of the screens correctly, I'm going to put navigate form new screen. So that is effectively, regardless of what screen I'm on, it's going when this onNew fires, it's going to run new form. It's going to navigate me to that relevant form. So let's go and do exactly the same on the onEdit event. So again, at the moment it says edit form, but it's still pointing at form new request. That's not right for me now. So I'm going to go and change my form name here to form edit request. So I'll come back to my integration. Let's come back to my onEdit. On my edit form, let's go and change that to form edit request. Then I'm going to need to navigate my edit screen. So by doing that, that will then allow me to switch between those two screens depending on what the user is actually doing on the list. If they're going and pressing new, then it will bring them into the new form. If they're trying to edit something, it will bring them into edit. Let's just go and try that. So let's go and save, and let's publish it. Okay, so back to SharePoint. Oops. Finger, small keys. So if I go to new, there we go, it's loaded my form, and so it's now giving me my new form, so I can see my title, I can see my from and to, my comments. So I can put some information in here. Let's go in book some holiday, so I'm going to book tomorrow. And I'm just going to have those days. And then I can go and save that. And it quite happily saves that for me. Now let's come and edit it. So I edit it. You can see there it's now navigated me across to my edit form. So I've got my additional fields. I've got those that I've made read-only on this particular form. And I've got my additional ones that I can then go and fill in. So whether I'm pending, approving, rejected, and so on. So let's go and put some manager comments in here. And let's approve this. So I've saved that, but it hasn't actually saved. Let's just do a refresh there and make sure that I'm not dreaming. No, okay, so there's a little bit more configuration that I need to do in order to make the actual save functionality recognize that I may be taking inputs now from multiple forms. So back to Power Apps. What else have I got on my SharePoint integration? Because remember, this is how I'm defining how my interactions take place. I've got onSave. So this is the event that fires when someone presses the save button. And what's it doing by default? It's submitting form, which is fine, but it's only submitting one form. It's submitting form new request. But I need to start thinking about, okay, so how do I tell it which form that I needed to submit? Because if I also put in there submit form edit request, it's going to try and submit both forms, which means I'm going to get contention on the list item, so it's not going to work quite as I want it to. So the way that we achieve this, if I go back to onNew, what I need to do is, as part of my onNew event here, I need to go and set myself a variable. So I'm going to call this my form action, and I'm going to tell it what form I'm actually going to be, what the action is that I'm going to be doing. So in this one, it's going to be new. So remember, because we're also going to be taking inputs from an edit form, I need to do the same for onEdit. All right. I'm going to paste that into there, and rather than being new, that is going to be edit. So now that I've done that, let's go and use that in the context of onSave. So in onSave, I've got my submit form. So I can either use an if or I can use a switch, depending on different things that are taking place. So I like to use switch, so I've got more options if I ever need it. So I'm going to go switch, and I'm going to go far. I don't know my cursor keys don't like. Form action. What's it going to match? It's going to match new. Next line. And if it's new, then I'm going to submit the form, and I'm going to submit form new request. Edit. I'm going to submit form again, but I'm going to submit form edit request. So now I am going to, based on whether I'm editing or whether it's new, my app now knows which form it needs to submit based on the action that's being carried out. So let's go and save that again. And let's publish that. Here we go again. This is where I should have actually turned my header a different color to see whether I'm actually using the latest app. So let's come in here and let's go and edit. I saw the whirly, so I'm going to assume that this is the right version. And let's go and approve that. A nice kind manager, let's say yes, of course. Let's save that, and then that will feed that back. So there's a couple of things that you need to remember if you're trying to employ multiple forms within your list form experience. So time's running on. There's one more thing that I'm really just going to point out that becomes really handy here. So quite often, if we need to integrate with Power Automate at this point, and so we have flows, whether that's sending notifications, triggering the approval process, whatever it might be, we can go down the normal route of having a trigger in the flow which says I'm going to trigger based on a new item or an item being modified or created. However, that is even though it's an automatic trigger, you need to remember that's running on a 5-minute poll. So if you ever want something that's running on a much faster trigger basis, then you can still create a flow using the Power Automate trigger, which is an instant trigger, which means I can then trigger it immediately. But how do I use that within my list? And one of the cool things, and especially when I do Power Apps training courses, which most people tend to forget, is that I can associate my flows with a form action when it's submitted. So, for example, if I use my form edit screen, I can look at what I've actually got. That's not my form. There we go. On here, I have a couple of events actually related to the form that I can then use to start bringing in those integrations with Power Automate. I've got onSuccess. So onSuccess at the moment does a couple of things. It does a reset form and it does a request hide. So basically, that is going to when the SharePoint answers back saying yes, I'm happy, I've got that request. It's going to reset the form, so it's going to clear it, and then it's going to hide it, so it's going to hide the blade. So I'm just going to grab that because what actually happens, copy that instead, when I go and associate a flow with this, is that it will wipe all this out for me. So I need to make sure I copy all that before I go. But I can go to my actions. Now, I don't know whether this is something that's only recently become available to the SharePoint list forms, or whether it's there and I've just had a disappearing act over the last few days. But when I was putting my demo together a few days ago, this wasn't here, and I was going to go, be aware that you can't do this from within a list experience. However, when I went through the practice again today, lo and behold, it was there, so I can show you all the goodness that we can bring in from Power Automate. So I can go and select Power Automate. That's going to go away, and it's going to find all of the flows that I've got a Power Apps trigger. And I'm just going to go and select that. It says Power Apps triggered flow. So that's going to add that. Yeah, notice that it adds it into my into there. I can then supply it with any of the parameters that I've requested through the trigger. So I'm just going to go and put some text in there because I know that's what that wants. And then I can paste in my other formulas back in. So then when I successfully submit this form, and it's ideal to do it on success so that you don't trigger anything before you actually want it to run. I can trigger the flow, I can reset my form, I can hide the blade, and then we can have an instant response from flow in terms of notifications and so on, without having to wait for that poll. So that's just some nice things that you can do to improve the user experience and the reaction times within your Power App. If you one more thing before I actually go and quickly look at the governance aspect of this, because that's always a pertinent question, is if I come onto here, I can still do saves within buttons. So I can go onto here, I can go and insert my icon. Let's go and find my save button. It's always far too big for me. So I'm going to go and shrink that down slightly. So I can give my users the option of either using the save at the top of the screen, or if I want to give them a more graphical option within the context of the form, then I can do exactly the same here. So on my onSelect, I can submit form. I can tell it which form I want it to submit. And then that will quite happily go away and then submit the form. It will run the onSave for me. It will then actually go and do anything from the onSuccess from that form as well. So we're in a good position. So I can really start to build out the full functionality of my app. I can have it switching between multiple screens, even to the point where you can check to see if a user is an administrator. And if you've not checked out Reza Durrani's latest video on a really simple way of checking it if a user is an admin, go and check that out. I'll post that in, make sure that goes out with a post afterwards. But it's really simple just to use a SharePoint group with some users in, with some very basic list item permissions, and then you can apply permission handling into here as well. So that allows me to permission handle on fields, actually on actions, so you can really start to make these apps quite in depth. So very quickly, because we're running out of time, obviously I've created an app. The app, if I go across to the Power Apps home, doesn't actually appear as an app because it's not a fully fledged app that can be deployed and accessed through the Power Apps app or even shared with different people. The app lives within the context of the list. So it's still an app in the background, and I'll show you at the moment how you can go and see what apps have been created with regards to list items. But it's worthwhile knowing that the ownership belongs to the list. So one of the nice things is that you haven't got to worry about sharing that with anybody, because if people can access the list, then they can and contribute on that list, then they can use it. If they have edit rights to the list, then they can go and modify that form. So again, you don't have to worry about sharing it. And the form will always run within the context of the user who's accessing it. So you won't have a permissions issue, because I'm, as an admin, creating this, and someone who's just a standard user comes in, they won't be able to do things that they won't be able to do. So it's very nice in the way that all that relies on SharePoint in order to give it that whole permission definition. But there's I can see a lot of anarchy coming here, particularly for admins who are like, no, you can't use those Power Apps, purely because they are not governed, because we can't, as an IT department, we don't know they're there, and so on. The answer is they actually do appear, if I can find it, here it is, in the admin center. So if you go across to the Power Apps admin center, they do appear in apps. And it's worthwhile knowing that they always get created in the default environment for your tenancy. So in here, you'll see that I've got an app type column, and I've got my standard apps, but I've also got SharePoint forms. So this is where I can see all the forms that have been created. If I go and look at my details, and it will actually tell me the address of the list where it's being created as well. So it's really so there's actually that little bit of governance that's in place in the admin center for you as administrators to make sure that your users are using these in the correct way, supporting them if you need to, and then really maintaining that control over your environment. So that's it. That's all I've got time for, really, in terms of really what is quite a basic introduction to how we can use Power Apps to change the list form experience. And just remember that as of, I think it was the end of last year, it rolled out that I can do this within a list, but I can now also do this for the metadata on a document library as well. Are there any questions?
That was awesome, Matt. I have one question. When you want to create a Power App that's going to be sat on the top of a list, can you add things to other lists as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So for all intents and purposes, this actually behaves like a normal Power App. So I've still got my data sources down here. So you can see here that I've got multiple data sources because I've got my flow integration. But if I wanted to go and get information from another SharePoint list as an example, then I can do that. If I wanted to use HTTP, I've got the ability to do that. I can even access my my CDS entities from here as well. So I can still integrate with other data sources. And if you've got control, because you've got control over what happens on the on save, you don't just have to save to this one list. You can be updating multiple lists at exactly the same time, whether that's pushing through Power Automate, or whether you're using the patch command and then going out and patching those different data sources as well. So you can not only can you consume information, you can also update multiple data sources at the same time.
So the entry point into this app is essentially one list, but you have the full power of Canvas apps once you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and like I say, up until a few days ago, I was very much prepared to give a bit of a gap analysis on these are the things that I can't find within this experience, but they seem to have been closed today. So kudos Microsoft. It may have just been that it was just rolling out to the UK tenancies and I was using a different tenancy beforehand. So, but yeah, it's all there. It's all worthwhile having a play with and just seeing what you can do to really improve that experience.
Looks great. Really, really good. Looks really good.
Okay, cool. So just a very quick recap then, because this is the key one, is though that's the what I found in terms of support for the various data types within SharePoint. But just even though they're not supported out of the box, there's no reason why you can't go and try and make other ways of interacting with them, creating your own components and so on, to try and replicate some of those things that you could potentially have done with SharePoint out of the box previously. So key lessons. The Power Apps, as soon as you once they're shared, and they're shared immediately as soon as they're published. So as soon as you publish, then everyone can start using them. They're always created in the default environment. So just remember, if you have got specific around that data policies as well, then it will adhere to those. And on start and on visible only runs once on the on that app until you refresh the list. That's navigating away or just doing a full refresh. Otherwise, it will just keep the app open in the background and just keep using it. Very quick shout out then. So on the 12th of May is the Black Country Power Apps and Power Automate user group. It is online only. It'll be in a similar context to this, using Teams. We've got the fantastic Alan Eardley, who's doing his Virgin presentation of model-driven apps for beginners, which I'm looking forward to because I've done very little with it, so I'm looking forward to learning stuff around that. And Laura Graham Brown, who's also doing a presentation on adaptive cards. So if it's anything, if the video online is anything to go by, that's going to be a fantastic session as well. There's the sign up link. Go and sign up. If you've got any questions around the automation that's running that, then by all means ping me as well, and I'll be happy to. I'll be doing a webinar about that in a few weeks' time. So thank you for having me. Thank you for bearing with me while I had my little blip earlier. I hope you all stick around for a PowerPoint, and yeah, I look forward to having a good chat with you. Thanks, guys.
Who can edit that app, Matt?
Oh, say again.
Who's allowed to edit your app in that SharePoint list?
Yeah.
Right. What level of permissions do I need if I'm a naughty sausage coming to your site, coming to your SharePoint site? Can anyone edit it, or do I need special permissions?
So you need the edit permission. So edit allows you to go into the list settings area and actually start messing about with that. So by default, if you are a member of a team, you get edit permissions, which is one of the things that I really don't like about the SharePoint permission model, because I don't want everybody who's a member to go and start just creating lists, editing lists, and so on. So the first thing that I would do is change them to contribute. So the difference between the contribute and edit rights is that edit right gives me the ability to go into. Let's go and actually show you.
But in terms of editing the app, is that contribute or is that edit?
So it's still edit. So I need those the ability to go and change those list settings, which comes with the edit permission. If I'm a contributor, then I am only able to create, read, update, delete. I can't go and change the app.
Okay, gotcha.
How do you turn the forms back to being the originals?
Great question. So that all takes place within list settings. Let me just zoom in a little bit. So within list settings, I've got my form settings down here. So if I go and click on my form settings, and again, this is just an illustration that you need to be able to edit to come into here. Then as soon as I publish my Power App for the first time, it will automatically change the setting here to use a custom form created in Power Apps. And obviously it just calls out there, requires a new list experience. So this won't work in Classic. But this is quite nice that you can come and see the versions. And if you want to switch it back, you just go use the default SharePoint form. So at the moment, that will keep the customized form in the background, but just won't use it. If you want to use, or if you want to delete that form, then you've got, once you switch back to default, it will come up here, delete custom form, and then that will get rid of that customization for you. And just pretend you don't see the bottom one.
I was going to say, and you can't click on the bottom one, can you?
No, you can't now. No.
Nobody should click on that.
Delete it. Come on, Microsoft.
You know you want to.
I think you mentioned governance in there as well, Matt. And I think the other thing is that all of these always go into the default environment, don't they?
Yes.
So you can't yet choose to put one of these Power Apps into a specific environment that's maybe more locked down than the default environment.
No, that's correct. So when I actually in the actual editing experience here, I don't even have don't even see any of the environments that I've got.
Yeah.
Now I double checked this just to make sure it wasn't a license thing. So I went across into where I've got one of the old Power Apps Plan 2s, and it's exactly the same experience on that plan as well. So it just doesn't show up or even acknowledge the existence of any other environments.
And on licensing, you don't need any additional licensing if you have an Office 365 license.
No, just a standard Office 365. Any Office 365 license that ships Power Apps, you can use this.
Yep.
So it's, and I'm using this quite actively in a number of small business, or what was the business level licenses at the moment. So it's generally available for a lot of uses.
What about if you go off and use premium connectors though? Off to SQL or HTTP requests. I'm guessing we need
or CDS or any of the other things.
So obviously, because it's in the context of the user who's using it, you won't be able. If that user's not licensed to use it, then you're going to just get failures. So it won't execute it. So you can't even get around it in different ways, like trying to do it as a service account or any of those things, workarounds that we have in Flow. So yeah, you're generally bound very tightly by the licensing that you're assigned.
It's a real problem that you can't move them to other environments, because it means you're hamstrung really by the data leakage policies. Like if you want to,
you can kind of.
What you
I
can
do is
export
not
it
the
and
best
import it.
intuitive experience, but you can actually just have that app as a placeholder that launches an app in another environment.
And most SharePoint admins don't know about DLP and Power Platform anyway, so they don't do it.
Yeah, I noticed. Wild West.
Can we disconnect him now? Because don't forget, I am a SharePoint admin and SharePoint developer by background.
So I mean, I say that just from experience of, obviously, when I go in and help organisations deploying Office 365, they're not always thinking about Power Platform first of all. But the first thing we do is we tell them you need to be thinking about DLP across everything, because obviously I could, with a Power Automate, I can copy data into Gmail and Google without even thinking about it, and it happens outside the perimeter. So
Logic apps are affected, and some Azure functions as well are affected by DLP.
Yeah.
So it's you should be. It has to be on your radar, I think. Yeah. And environmentally speaking, like, granted, Sancho, it's a nice workaround, but it doesn't like.
It's not great UX.
It's not great UX. I mean, it's going to be crappy. Like it's horrible.
So I think there are with the DLP side of it, there are always ways to work around it, and I think that's still a challenge that Microsoft has to address. Things going into the default environments, you should be able to move everything,
and that should be fairly simple.
As a SharePoint developer, you're going to want dev test. At the end of the day, right? SharePoint developers are proper developers. They're a lot of the time they're pro coders, and you're going to want dev test prod.
Yes.
Like, absolutely, you're going to want dev test prod. So therefore, you need
I'm going to
solutions.
challenge that statement, because I don't think Microsoft focus this on the dev community, because one of the big asks that the dev community had is, let's have SPFX on list forms, and it's not coming. It's not coming anytime soon, because Microsoft want people to do Power Platform.
I get that, but what you find is that, like, as soon as you enter into Sancho's world, right, and my world of when I was in Ariva, you massively start needing that, because
Yeah.
like I don't want to be editing the form live
for SPFX on list forms. Everyone wants it. Every developer I ever speak to, I mean, Andrew Connell is one of the biggest people bleating out that we need SPFX on list forms. From my, the work I used to do with JS Link, we used to customize list form heavily. We'd put JavaScript on them. You'd pass parameters in. The biggest hole in this whole experience for me is I cannot pass parameters into a SharePoint list form Power App. It doesn't work. It's actually stripped by the SharePoint side of things. So I can take a Power App that I can pass a parameters object to, and it works perfectly. If I do exactly the same in a Power App list form, fails. So I can't do parent-child list relationships that I would have done previously in JS Link just by passing a parameter. And without that, for me, that actually cripples the whole experience. It's really, some of the stuff.
The only workaround I've seen for that, Paul, is if you've got the list link item, when you cast it to SharePoint, it renders it as a Power App. Like if they list, at least that's what it was doing 6 months ago when I was in Ariva Land. Like, and I was saying, I'll go and edit that thing, and it would take you to the list, a layout of it.
Yeah,
it wasn't a great experience, I've got to say. Yes, I think hopefully, in the next sort of year or two, it will improve. I know, that Ryan Cunningham's kind of said, and so has Charles Lamarna said, they're slowing their release cadence down to focus on quality first, because they've sort of had a big ramp up of features, and now it's time to sort of like do it right. Because now that, like, when they change something, they're affecting a lot of people, but it does mean that they really need to start fixing some of these more frustrating features, should we say.
And I think there's the advantage of being able to do this is it's now something that for about 4 or 5 years, the only option that we've had has been to use things that are shunned, InfoPath, SharePoint Destroyer, various things like that, and
JavaScript in list forms.
JavaScript list forms, and I think at least this gives the citizen developer, that ability to improve the way they interact with those forms, those list forms,
yep.
And it increases the productivity of teams when they can take on the ownership of it.
I just think there's a few, I mean, the parameters one. I've had quite a few conversations with Chakradeep on the SharePoint side, so he owns the list form experience for SharePoint, and he's flatly said that there's no focus on fixing the parameters issue. They don't see it as a bug; they see it as working as intended. And that for me is probably one of the biggest reasons why I've still got clients using classic list forms, because they want to be able to go from a list and go create a new item that's related to this item. And the only way you can do that is to pass a parameter. So if they want to move to the Power Platform model, they've got to look at embedding a Power App in a page. And that's the only way they can pass the parameters. But then that takes away the whole, pre-gluing up of the Power App, which is there for you in the list form. And it also means you've got the same, and Matt picked on it earlier, is that, okay, so I've created a custom form, but nothing stops my users going to the list directly. And that just breaks the experience.
Yeah, but also, I mean, I noticed last night my tenancy got updated, and I can now block connectors on my DLP, which is a major step forward.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, the PowerShell still doesn't work, but at least I can now block connectors, because I had a situation where I had a customer who had SharePoint as the only connector, and there was no way you could block them from using SharePoint until now, and that's a major step forward in my view.
I agree, mate. I think that's been one of the missing things. I mean, I think their plans for DLP is very, what they're hoping to do is very good from what they said on the roadmap, but it seems to all be taking as long as Teams now, as long as changes to Teams. So I'm just going to say that's my benchmark. Anything that takes as long as Teams does to release a new feature, you're going to annoy me.
Teams are ramping out the features at the moment in response to Zoom.
Yeah. And it funny what a little bit of competition brings.
I think they need to rename the policy, because let's face it, it's not data loss policy, is it? It's a Chinese wall. That's all it is. It's a wall between the data that can and the data that can't.
But now you've got the ability to block. It's kind of getting there.
I want to see stuff that allows me to use this connector unless the data is actually triggered by a DLP policy.
DLP, yeah, classification of data.
But, you know,
oh right, that granular.
I should be able to send a document to Google unless it's one of my sensitive policy types.
So that's what they're saying, Paul, is that like, and that's where the environmental thing comes in, where each environment is kind of gets its own DLP, a sub DLP policy. But that means that like you're potentially then having a DLP per like. I mean, it could just get really messy.
So that's what I'm saying. It's not really a DLP policy, is it? It's a data can or can't. To me, a DLP policy is I'm aware of the type of data. So it's like, you know, if I've got something that's sensitive, a DL policy should be able to say, I'm going to allow that data through, or I'm not going to allow that data through based on its classification.
But then it's what we saw does what, I mean, like it's how granular you want to get. Because I mean, you know, you're potentially talking about a cell on a list item, you know, a single record on a list item. But like if you look last month when we had the what's his name, was it the chap who did the security thing with the
Dylan Hayes.
Yeah, that was really good, you know, and that kind of satisfied a lot of, I don't know, potential. But I think you're right, like it's some stuff I want to be able to send out and some stuff I don't, and I kind of I don't want to have to create an additional security problem with having 300 million environments and all that kind of stuff.
Kind of comes down to how many environments you have as well, doesn't it? Which is a whole different question. And I think, you know, the option of having one default environment that everything goes into.
You rename as apps to be deleted.
Playpen, sandpit, whatever. Yeah. But I think that's one of the challenges, though, isn't it? Is the fact that by default lots of this stuff goes into one location and you only have the chance to put one policy on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but if you look at now, Microsoft come out with the best practices how you should set up your environment now. And okay, you're still only using test and prod, but in my view, we should be using dev, test, and prod. And if you want to use default as your dev playpen, then go ahead. But when it moves into pre-prod, or what it tests when they call it, then there has to be some gate it has to go through, governance gate it has to go through to get onto the test environment. And then there's a different DLP when you put it onto prod.
Yeah, the environments give you that flexibility, but I think as we've identified, there are times when you want the content to define the policy that's going to be applied. You know, I can send some stuff out, happy, don't worry about it. You know, it's a press release, but other things, they're HR documents, and I want the classifications to be driving that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, AIP rules.
Indeed.
What Matt was saying earlier about the edit and contribute, I just remembered it does default to edit, but if you make a separate contribute group, you can set that as the default. So have everyone just initially pile in to contribute. Just worth mentioning if anyone else didn't know that who's watching.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where you need Paul's flows to actually go through and set up the permissions on every site that you create. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good thing. As well as setting that up, make sure you do set it as the default group. Otherwise, all users will still pile into the default members and therefore get edit rights.
Yeah,
I've seen that happen quite a few times.
So you mentioned Paul's flows there, Al.
Yeah.
Now, there's a young man who I wish was at our user group and hasn't turned up yet, which is a great shame. He works for TfL, right?
Okay.
Now, I met him at Ignite the Tour, and suffice to say, everything that Microsoft built, he didn't know they'd built it, right? So he built his own.
This is Simeon, isn't it? Yeah, I think I know. I know
it is.
Yeah, it is Simeon, isn't it?
I think we met a guy like, and we were like, what he'd built was he'd said, right, well, stuff it. He was in my mind, he's the classic citizen developer. Like no one was more of a citizen developer than he, and And it was like, right, I have all these problems. I'm going to make my solutions. So he figured out he wanted to turn all the flows off. So every single flow he had called a SharePoint list.
Yeah.
That had one item in it that said whether flow was turned on or off. Right, and he just flipped that switch and it just turned all his flows off. And if it was yes, then it went to term. If it was yes, it just went to terminate. If it was no, it carried on.
Yeah, he had the ultimate control over everything that he was doing, didn't he?
Boom.
Yeah,
you know, and it was like he can sit there with his sort of his switches. And then he'd built a load of apps that every app referred back to this key control list that he had access to, like he'd set it up like in a nice way. And it was like it'd say, oh, if you don't surface and refresh your data, like your saved data in the app in every 3 days or whatever it is, the app would just stop working. All this kind of stuff. Like he built his own center of excellence tooling. Like
there was another one he built. He had the apps again called to a list, a SharePoint list that the users had control of, so the users could turn off the app to do data maintenance, and then turn it back on.
Yeah.
And he made an app to touch that list that had the settings as well, so the users had full control. He didn't have to get involved. It was great.
Yeah. No, some smart stuff. Yeah.
We need to get him on here.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? There's so much potential for what we can do with the platform. Bit of imagination, a bit of hard work and graft to get there, and it's amazing what we can achieve. And alcohol, yeah. I think somebody said. Did somebody say alcohol there?
Yeah.
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 Excellent. So I guess speaking of alcohol, it should be time for a SharePoint, shouldn't it?
Sounds good to me.
Or PowerPoint.
Yeah, where do we want to do this? We're going to do this here, or do we want to go down the Badger?
Down the Badger.
Down the Badger.
Get down the Badger.
This is where we could all do the same background, couldn't we? Which is a pub.
Should we all go down the Badger?
Is everybody aware of the Badger? So there's a link, isn't there, on the virtual events hub.com.
Yeah, I'm going to find it.
Don't post it in Twitter, whatever you do.
No.
Because you get Zoom bombed, and then everyone comes in and starts playing pornography.
So yeah, I guess we do have to apologise for not having the comments on the chat for this. We will make sure it's back for the next time.
Yeah. Well, if you've been in the Power Platform virtual half hour last night, you find that they got Zoom bombed, so I had to change the URL pretty darn.
Yeah, I did hear about.
It's not that Zoom bombed us. Started playing a load of pornography, and then we just started threatening them, and we were like, "This pornography's not even really good. Like, if you've got something like this isn't good enough."
I chose the wrong group to Zoom.
We've seen this all before. So what I decided to do, I do reverse Zoom bombing. So I just put a Zoom link on Twitter on my alt account and just sit here stark bollock naked. It really screws people up because they think they're coming to Zoom bomb me, and I'm just sitting here like naked, covered in peanut butter and feathers.
Right,
there are images I just don't need.
It's great.
I used to like peanut butter.
I still do.
Smooth or crunchy?
It depends on where I'm putting it.
Oh, please stop pictures. No.
You give me Laura ideas.
It's too late, isn't it, Laura?
The crunchy bit's chafe.
No, you did. Oh, some pictures you can't get out your head now.
Right, let's go down the Badger. I haven't. I could show you that anyway. virtualentsHub.com, and then the link's there for tonight's the virtual bar, and we'll all hang out with a warning. Chris Huntingford doesn't go far to wee; he just kind of wheezes out of his door. So just in case you see his bum, that's what that's all about.
You're right. You're pitching it well there.
It's a good giggle. Right, I'll see you there in a bit.
See you there in a sec.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.